just have to make sure I do that a few times so that I have it.
Okay.
So we were talking about Tommy Douglas yesterday and the prairies and your days out there, and I know you've been thinking about those days, and there's some things you'd like to tell. Can maybe you start a bit about yourself and your time there when Tommy was there?
Well, my time there doesn't begin when he began. And to understand Tommy, we have to eventually come to when he began.
Sure.
My time was in two different contexts completely. The first 4 years were as a rural, isolated general practitioner, and my second period was in the government, with a gap between them of 2 years. I don't think my presence there had very much to do with what I think of the province, because it's astonishing. I've tried to write my first 40 years of history, and I didn't really think about much. I kind of went with the flow. So I acquired a lot of great experiences there, but it was many years later that I really began to understand the significance of a lot of the things that Tommy did. He was just a tremendously talented man. That's why we have to go to the beginning, because
sure, let's go to the beginning.
His talents were not endless. And, he lived in a completely different context than now. So one can romanticize it and say, why don't we do that now? And a lot of those things, you can't do them now. For instance, he took over Saskatchewan at a time when it was primarily rural. In other words, I don't know what percentage, but I would think 80% of the people lived in a shack or a house on a farm, or else they lived in a village of less than 1,000 people. And they were all over the southern half of the province. Now, of course, it's much more urban, like every place else. But that population was still very pioneer-like. It had a terrible depression behind it, so that its expectations were sort of zero, which is again so different from today. And when he arrived, well, first of all, as people know, he was a federal member of parliament, so he got an appreciation for government, but no experience in running a government, because he would just be a kind of a voice in the wilderness with a few others. So when he took over Saskatchewan, the context is it was an absolutely bankrupt province, and I mean bankrupt. It was living entirely because the federal government was giving it money, or had lent it money, which it could theoretically claim back if it wanted to. So there was no money really to do anything. Tommy had no experience, and he had a whole cabinet with no experience in really doing anything. And the first term was actually not particularly impressive. I didn't live through that. That would be, I forget when he started, but in the early 40s. So that first term, people didn't expect a lot. And his whole task was to try to stabilize the finances of the province. And he did that, much to his credit. And I don't know how many people know the stories, because they all have been written about how he had to, first of all, contend with the federal government, because a guy called Gardner was the Minister of Agriculture. And he, as a Liberal, wanted to demand that the province return all of the money that it owed the federal government, which would have finished the province. It would have had no money. And Douglas went on national radio and shamed the federal government, Mackenzie King in particular, who was smarter than Gardner, saying, I'm not going to fight with Tommy Douglas on the radio, I'll lose. And then he went to New York and satisfied the financiers that he wasn't a communist who was going to cancel all the debt and refuse to pay his money. So his first term really was a kind of a stabilization and learning term. They tried silly little things. They had a box factory, which was a disaster, and of course the opposition talked about that for generations. But by the second term, he was getting smart enough to do things, but he had already established a number of principles, which one in particular that really has always impressed me. He said, I will never give you a service unless it is paid for right now. It was all pay as you go. He never borrowed money in his whole political career of almost 20 years to pay for a social program. He said, if it is something that will bring the money back over time, then I'll borrow money, like to build a telephone system or a hydro system or a steel mill or whatever it was. But for hospitalization or medical care or schools or social services, if I deliver it to you, your taxes will go up. And he always told people this. He just said, the more you make, the more I'll make you pay, but everybody's going to have to pay because I'm not going to borrow money to do these things that you all want me to do. And here the population becomes important because these are people that were all scrabbling around trying to survive. And they understood that principle well enough to say, well, as long as I see the benefit of the tax, most of them said, we'll pay it. And that really is his, I guess that's one of his most fundamental principles, is don't borrow money for a social service. The second thing he said was, equity is really important to me. And so when he looked at the problems of rural Saskatchewan, because those were the problems that mattered to him most, he said, to the extent that I can bring benefits to rural Saskatchewan, I will bring it to all of rural Saskatchewan, rather than the private model that says I'll run the telephone line to the point where it's still profitable to run it and then I'll stop. Because as he proceeded to serve rural Saskatchewan, he did 2 or 3 things that are really crucial, and those were roads, telephones, and hydro. And if you go back to my initial description of Saskatchewan with all these little people living in little hamlets and spread all over a barren prairie, for the women in particular, that was a life of absolute barrenness in the wintertime, because the roads weren't plowed, there was no telephone system, and there wasn't electricity, which, by the way, didn't matter, but the other 2 mattered. There's no communication, there's no nothing. Kids could hardly get to school. Schools were not very well financed or anything. So Douglas made these all public enterprises, and when he put in hydro, he said hydro will go everywhere that anybody is prepared to pay for it. In other words, it wasn't free electricity, it had a bill, but no matter where you lived, if you wanted it, as he put in his rural electrification program, that's where the line went. And the same thing applied to a telephone. You might go 5 miles for the last telephone, but that person got a telephone. The third thing in that rural picture that I mentioned was roads. And I don't know if you know the pattern of roads in rural areas, but applies right here in this community. The roads are lower than the surrounding fields. The first storm in the winter, the snow comes down in the prairies, it blows, so it fills into the top, and the road now has 10 inches of snow on it. You put a plow down it and you got a pile on each side, and the next time it snows it drifts to the top of the piles on each side, and after about 3 storms you can't plow it anymore. So Tommy just said, well, let's raise the roads. He high graded everything. When the wind blows, it blows the snow off the road, so you don't even have to plow them anymore. Now that just sounds so simple, but to the people in the country, that meant that now that the country's opening up, people are getting cars, they want to travel more. You could do it, whereas in the old system, you just about couldn't do it. There was one thing he tried to do in the late 50s. He tried to increase the size of rural municipalities, and he had a Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs called Mayor Brownstone, who ended up being the head of Oxfam or something. Sure. And he had a PhD. He decided that in good left-wing patterns, he would go out and talk to everybody about the merging of municipalities. And he soon learned that nobody wanted to merge with anybody, because you think of maybe the average rural municipality wouldn't have 1,000 people. How do you plow a road? How do you do anything? But they all liked having their own council so much that the rural amalgamation program never developed. Good principle, but if the people didn't want it, you couldn't do it. Now, people remember Douglas primarily for what he did in healthcare. And I think everybody knows the history of why he was so interested in healthcare. There are really only 2, his personal illness, when he could have lost a leg, and the British National Health Service, which he used as his model. I'm one of the few people who think that of all the things he did, the healthcare progress was not nearly as important as the others. He stabilized the welfare system, he stabilized the income system, and he gave these rural people an opportunity for definitely higher quality of life, a lot more safety. Healthcare, by the time he got into it, the first was hospital insurance. He was never able to copy the National Health Service because it included dentistry and social work and everything, and Saskatchewan couldn't afford that because, remember, there was no federal involvement in healthcare. There was no money coming from anybody to help Saskatchewan bring in a hospital insurance program, which he did. And remember my rule about if you introduce it, you got to pay for it. They always underestimated the annual cost, what next year's cost would be, so every budget was too small. Every year they had to borrow money to pay the difference, but the following year they would have to, taxes would go up so the costs could be met as predicted, and they would again be too low. By the time Medicare came in, which was 1962, the British National Health Service had already been in business for 17 years. I forget when it came in, 45, 46. Britain had already learned that giving people free health care and free dental care and everything barely began to solve their social problems. That the real important factors in how healthy a population are in housing and employment and safety and education and environments, a variety of environments. And Douglas could have taken that to heart, but he was really personally dedicated to the idea of free health care. Any kind of a co-insurance would have been a better arrangement where people had to pay something for it, because we are now wedded to this idea that healthcare is so sacred that it's strapping every government. And later on I'll come to why some of the things that he did you can't do now. The environment has changed so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their reaction.
We've mostly talked about some of the specifics that he did, like roads and healthcare and schools and things. Behind it all was Tommy Douglas's almost obsessive aversion to debt. And perhaps this is the most astonishing thing that he did, because he took a province absolutely broke. And I don't remember when he became debt-free, but I would think it was probably around 10 or 12 years after he took office. Taxes were going up all the time, services were going up all the time, and of course if you look at the period in history, government incomes were going up all the time, so people can say, well, he was just lucky because it was late war, everything booming, post-war, everything booming. But other provinces weren't doing anything like what he was doing. Alberta had struck oil. But his obsession said, we don't just pay off debt, which he objected to because he said the more you owe, the more you can only do what your debtors want you to do. He said we need to put money in the bank. So by the time the CCF lost the election in 1964, they had $3 or $4 billion in their heritage fund, which in those days was a huge amount of money, and it's about equivalent to what Alberta had in its heritage fund 40 years later. So he did this absolutely unbelievable fiscal rearrangement. He did it partly by demanding that people pay for things, and partly by accepting that or approving of public enterprises to make money. And he tried a few that didn't make money, but then as he got better at it, he had a number that just made huge amounts of money. He had a steel mill that ran all through the bad years when the private steel mills in Calgary were running 3 shifts a week. He was running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week in the Saskatchewan steel mill. If you drove through the countryside, and it was entirely recycled steel or iron, if you drove through the country, you never saw an implement sitting in a field rusting. It had gone to the steel mill long ago. Whereas as soon as you left the borders, if Saskatchewan hadn't bought it, they were all over the place. The same thing with the first potash mine. He knew he had this resource. the private world was not interested in developing it. He built a great big potash mine which made money for the province until the later parties with power sold it off to the private sector. But he did many things that allowed him to balance the budget. But my main point is his obsession about not going in debt. He would have accepted, and he did, that when times are bad, you go in debt because you must last until the bad time ends. But then he would have said, you must pay it off, and he would have. And if I was talking about a comparison between him and parties like Harris's, or here in Ontario when Premier Harris was here, how badly the right-wing parties tend to manage money. The biggest difference between the left and the right, if you think of Douglas as the left and Harris as the right, the biggest difference is that one's a good money manager and one isn't. And the Conservatives, who have built their whole image around being good money managers, if you go through the national experience with them, they're lousy, lousy, lousy money managers. So Douglas, although remembered for Medicare, should be remembered for the equity part, for the breadth of his response to people's problems, and for his wisdom in terms of debt. I mean, he just hated it. It isn't that healthcare is unimportant, and people will hear me as if I'm saying that. It is just one of a whole series of things. And since virtually nothing else is available to people with some contribution, the telephones, you had to pay for them in Saskatchewan. Hydro, you had to pay for it in Saskatchewan. So except for roads and schools, you had to pay for them. It is quite reasonable to pay something for healthcare because it keeps it from being such a suck on every other kind of social spending, which is a part of the big change in context between then and now. One that I haven't mentioned is that in Douglas's days, when the private sector was mad at you, and they hated him at election time and loved him between elections. They did. They absolutely loved him, or at least they liked him. But they were primarily local industries. In other words, he was talking to a mine that was in Saskatchewan, operated by somebody who lived in Saskatchewan, etc. The internationalization of everything had not yet occurred. So he had lots of ability to negotiate with most of the people who had to pay him taxes, because he couldn't go anywhere else. It's sort of like the corner grocery store or the laundromat or something. And that's so changed now. The other big contextual change is the ability of, the willingness of Saskatchewan people to accept that if they got something, they had to pay for it. Now the general mood is that governments have some kind of a pocket that they reach into and get money as if it comes from somewhere other than the pockets of the people to whom they're giving something. And that's a huge change, which means that I don't think that many of the things that Douglas did could be done now. It doesn't alter the absolutely marvelous record he left. Because if you look all across the country, from coast to coast, there's really nobody that was doing anything comparable. Saskatchewan, with very minimal wealth for quite a long time, did well. Alberta, which after 47 suddenly became oil rich, has done absolutely atrociously. Its services are worse. It's got a wonderful university. It's got a wonderful few things. But for the money that it's made, it should be as rich as Norway, and it hasn't really got anything, because I don't think Norway's North Sea oil is really, probably I doubt if it's as valuable as Alberta's oil. One way in which I haven't described Douglas is his attitude to the private sector. He was a staunch, probably the most complete left-winger you could find, but he never objected to profit. He always talked to business in the sense that I know you have to make money or you won't be here, and you can't hire anybody. My objective is merely to make sure that as you make money, that I get as much of it as I can so that we both are doing pretty well. That is a principle that is significantly different than some of the left-wingers that I've known in my rather varied and long ago political career, where it was very often very distressing about how anti-business the group of people were. They just seemed to hate anybody that was making more than they were going to make. I never could understand it. But anyway, that's important in Douglas's background, and it's relevant to my comment that between elections, governments liked him. He surrounded himself with a very bright, very young, talented, and very honest group of people, both in cabinet and in his civil service. And so governments trusted him implicitly. If he said to them, this is what we're going to do, that's what he would do. They knew that he would, if they came to him and said, we've got a problem, we cannot get around it, and your regulations are affecting us, he'd fix it, because he knew they had to succeed if he was going to do the things that he wanted to do. They were one of his sources of revenue. And he saw them as that, and therefore he cultivated them like we cultivate cows or cabbages or wheat fields. We do it because there's something in it for us. So between elections, there were tremendously good relations between the private sector and Douglas, even although every election they fought him to the teeth because they would have liked to have had a government which allowed them to make more. I haven't talked about Douglas as a political campaigner, and this is another bit of his character which is not unique, but it's different than most leaders. It's nice to be strong either as the government person who looks after the government or the political person who wins elections, but not very many people are really good in both those fields. During campaigns, Douglas was fierce. I mean, he just was fierce. People loved him. He was an orator. He was an attacker. He could respond as spur of the moment. Responses are superb, and my favorite is the time that the guy in the audience stood up at the back of the hall in a rural community and said, I could eat you. And Douglas said, if you did, you'd be the only man in this room with more brains in your stomach than your head. And he had that terrific response capacity, which is important to winning. And the CCF lost because they got a very able, sensible, dull leader who just could not compete with the abuse that came out of the introduction of Medicare. And that, if you've asked that I say something about myself, Medicare had a lot to do with me being in Saskatchewan, even though I hadn't known it when I graduated and started looking for a place to go. I did go to Saskatchewan looking for a practice because Saskatchewan had a terrific turnover of doctors, so there was all kinds of communities that were constantly looking for doctors. But I did happen by accident to end up in a little town called East End, which is in the very southwestern corner of Saskatchewan. And it happened to be, and I didn't even know this at the time, a part of a little experimental plot called Health Reason Number 1, which is 55,000 people, which the Saskatchewan government operated from the late 40s to find out about public payment for physician services. And so I ended up in a town where every time I did anything, I sent a bill not to the patient, but to an office in Swift Current, and they paid the bill. So I saw public payment systems firsthand, and in fact I don't know what I would have done if that hadn't happened, because I don't know how to, I'm not a very good businessman. But my whole first experience in Saskatchewan was kind of unpolitical. I always voted NDP or CCF before that, but I always said I did it because my father did it. I mean, I'd never really thought through very many things, and I didn't really do it until I got on council here in Ottawa in the 70s. But so I was a left-wing voter, but not a tremendously informed one, just a tremendously eager, I hope committed general practitioner, and went and practiced for 4 years. Then I went to Toronto, got some more education, and came back to the Saskatchewan government, because before I went to Toronto, they had come and said, we'll give you $500 a month while you're there if you'll come back and work for us. And that was a great benefit too. But when I came back, then I had a chance to again be deeply involved in these good things that we're talking about, but with no particular depth in my understanding of why they were good things or bad things. I just did my job. I'm a kind of a robot. And, well, I learned a lot about how you can foul up everything and how civil servants can work really well or they can, in fact, not work very well. And I had grown up feeling like a lot of left-wingers that every problem you have, you should give it to government, they'll solve it. I don't believe that anymore. Governments should be interested in all problems, but very often they are not the source of the solution. So when I came back, I worked in both the hospital system and then in the Medicare system as an administrator. And then I came to Ottawa to work for the federal government in what I thought was a really good job. Exactly the same pay as I got in Saskatchewan. And I suddenly got here and had more money because since I was a high income civil servant, I was paying twice as much taxes as I was when I got to Ontario, where I had a lot more money and no services. That's really my history in Saskatchewan. I learned a lot because the basis for most of the senior jobs I got was that I had an MD, and that was irrelevant to the things I had to do. So I had to learn from people around me who didn't have one, and some of them were really, really excellent. And I came here shortly after the Liberals had defeated the CCF in the provincial election and joined the Saskatchewan Mafia, which was a large group of very prominent people who came here, produced two deputy ministers of finance, deputy minister of agriculture. A whole lot of people who came from Saskatchewan became prominent people in the government of Canada, and almost all of them, in my opinion, were excellent. But that's how I ended up here. My career in Saskatchewan was very short, 8 years actually.
Do you have any advice for today's NDP?
Yeah, if I were running now, I would not avoid the issue of paying more taxes. It's absolutely crucial. And it doesn't matter whether it takes 2 years or 10 years. If you can't win the argument that says if you want things, you have to pay for them, then you shouldn't be in power anyway, because when you get there, you won't be able to do the things that you know you have to do. The second thing is you shouldn't be afraid to talk about long term, even although most of the population doesn't seem to care about the long term. Environmental issues are dead because it's going to be years before the ocean really rises. Or it interferes with, as the present Prime Minister says, it would be crazy to do that because it would interfere with the job or something. It isn't that these things are unimportant, there's no balance. So the NDP now, if it could just find the right people and have the courage to stay with it over time, should talk about things which are, for some reason, not talked about. For instance, Conservatives are lousy money managers. And I would use Alberta as the best example, but you have lots like Harris in Ontario, perfect example too. Just talk about all the things that for some reason or other are thought to be politically incorrect, and so you stay away from them. Don't hesitate to say you're going to tax people more, as long as you also say, and I will use the principle that you pay on the basis of your ability to pay. So that when you make a reasonable amount of money, you're going to pay not just a few more taxes, but a lot more taxes. And I wouldn't even bother emphasizing a lot the fact that in places like Sweden, for years they went with tax levels which make people's hair curl here, and they got used to them, and the people with high incomes didn't all leave town, and the industries didn't all leave the country, and you can use those if you want to, but basically you just make your major points and don't muck them up with little things that you think give you some kind of short-term advantage, especially during election time, because the time to talk about all these other things is not at election time. It's every day, all the time. More tax reform, smaller debt, higher taxes for everybody. Just that the more you make, the more that increase rises. That would be my whole advice. everything's short term, and there really is no reason why NDP voters and NDP candidates shouldn't be short term, because that seems to be our culture. But to me, it's a suicidal culture. If you're not going to be any different than anybody else, well, might as well join the crowd.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. And you might think of some other things you want to say later. The camera will still be around. I can always grab you, and we can even do something outside or something if that worked. Is there anything else you wanted to toss in? Or are you okay?
Oh, well,
I'm sure there's a lot more.
Well, the stories, I mean, the doctor strike, there are all kinds of things that are wonderful for stories, but they're not really anything in terms of the political context we're talking about.
We can always do a part 2.
Well, no, you see, I don't think most of these other things are very interesting to other people.
Well,
they're social conversation. Yeah, well, they're socially. If you want to have a conversation, the Medicare strike was fascinating. It was just hilarious in dozens of ways. It was great.
Well, let's make that another one. I'm also running out of the battery here.
Okay.